I'm Joseph Majkut. I'm the Director of the Energy Security and Climate Change Program here at CSIS, and it is my honor and privilege to welcome you all here today. Thank you for making it out on a rainy Monday here in Washington. Our topic today is one of great importance. How do we build realistic and robust visions of the future of the global energy system? It's a great time to be having this conversation because it feels like there are a couple of disruptive forces pushing on the energy system, pushing on our geopolitics, and trying to figure out what we can make of these and how we need to adjust our visions of the future to accommodate them is a really important task, and something that think tanks should take the lead on. So for those who are joining online and those here in the room, thank you for being part of the conversation. Few people in the world that I'd rather talk to about this issue than Thomas-Olivier Léautier. Yeah. Thomas is the chief economist at TotalEnergies. Note TotalEnergies, formerly Total Oil, now looks at the full energy system, makes investments across not just the world, but across energy technologies,
Absolutely.
Thinking about how are we going to meet the imperatives of economic growth, of energy access, and sustainability in the 21st century. Thomas, welcome to CSIS.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Did I properly introduce the stakes of the conversation for today?
Absolutely. It's a strange time in the energy system because we have some old elements and some new elements. The old elements, of course, is that energy is life. When you look at our world today, it's a world that was built on fossil energy from the Industrial Revolution onwards. So for the last 150 years, we've burned fossil energy, and that has given us all that we have today. So that constant is still present. What has changed, of course, is the imperative to keep emissions below a certain level if you want to keep global warming in check. And that tension between what is required, which is more energy, and what is also required, which is less emission, is very prevalent, and that's a tension that defines ourselves. And just as an introduction, this actually is the motto of our company, TotalEnergies. Our motto is more energy, less emissions, which illustrate exactly the conversations.
You have an incredible background to be talking about these issues at the leadership level, from experience in development finance to private consulting, academia,
yep.
and now working at Total. One of your jobs is setting the Energy Outlook. You published one last fall. What are the key lessons you took from the last exercise? Folks watching online can download it, I believe, from the website. And how has the last 3 months affected where we may find ourselves?
That's a great question. There's a couple of issues that stand out from the work we do. The first one, which we don't necessarily see living in Paris, or I'm assuming living in Washington, D.C., is that there are about 4.5 billion people on this planet that don't have enough energy. It means it's not like they don't have energy at all. They do have some energy, but they don't have enough. And if they had a bit more, life expectancy would be longer. Child mortality would be lower, illiteracy rate would be higher. It's 4.5 billion people today, more than half of the world, that need more energy to live better, fulfilling life. And we don't see that here, right? Because all of us have an enormous amount of energy at our disposal. But the first thing to realize is that for half of the world, that is not the case. So more energy is really essential. The second thing is, when you look at history, the way we solve our energy problem was essentially burning coal. When you look at the numbers, the Industrial Revolution, we start burning coal. You look at China in 2000, they start burning coal. And in fact, when you do the math, there's sort of a coincidence that every dollar of GDP that China built over the last 20 years cost us 556 grams of CO2. Every dollar of GDP. When we do the same thing for Europe, from 1850, and the United States, Europe and the United States, from 1850 to 2020, you get the same exact number. Every dollar of GDP, 556 grams of CO2. So what China has done over the last 20 years, which is immensely polluting, is lifting 800 million people out of poverty. And the cost of that is 556 grams of CO2 per dollar of GDP, exactly as we did with the Industrial Revolution. Now, one of the key questions facing us is, what about the next 4 billion people? When are they going to come out of poverty? Are they going to burn coal like we did? And 556 grams of CO2 times 4 billion people getting out of poverty, you can imagine that that's a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. Or are they going to find a new way to develop, a low carbon way to develop, using the new technologies that we have developed, solar panels, batteries, wind turbines, and so on and so forth. So that's really the challenge that we face. Is the future going to be the repetition of the past?
Yeah.
Or are we going to create a new way? And for that, and that's why your center is so important, it's not just technology. It's about delivering that technology to the people. It's about the geopolitics of delivering the technology. It's not just about plunking the solar panels, right? It's about who does that, to whom,
right.
Why, which financing, which security guarantees, and so on and so forth. That's a very interesting topic. So those are main findings.
So Secretary Chris Wright, now at the head of the DOE, last week gave a speech at CERAWeek, the big annual conference, and he did there and he's done it in other venues, has emphasized the energy poverty issue, and seems to be trying to reframe the U.S.'s, if not policy stance, moral stance on energy issues away from climate and toward access. One of the things I've always struggled with is energy products are pretty available around the world. And yet you've got this energy poverty issue. From your perspective, what are the key critical levers we should be thinking about, whether that's technology innovation, finance, institutional reforms in emerging markets? I mean, not just on the margins, how do we fundamentally approach this issue of 4.5 billion people meeting their development needs?
It's a great question. And I can tell you what it is not about, and then we can discuss what it is about. It's
Please.
Not about technology. We have the technology. I mean, solar panels now are dirt cheap. The cost of producing electricity with solar panel is lower than with most technologies. So you're going to tell me, well, but we produce only when the sun shines, and what about nights, and so on and so forth. But by and large, the technology is available today to provide clean electricity. And that's important. It's not just because we have energy. We can build coal-fired plants, but we have the technology to provide clean electricity. So it's not about technology. And you have electric cars and so on and so forth. So technology is available today at reasonable cost. It's not really about money, because the money is available. We're talking about a few GDP points. So it is money. It is not an insurmountable amount of money.
Right.
We're not talking about the investment that the US made, for example, to put a man on the moon, which I think was in the order of 10% of GDP at some point. I mean, I may be wrong with my numbers, but I know it was a significant share of the GDP at the time. This is not the numbers we're talking about. So the real challenge is the political and the governance. It's just the nexus of how does this country develop their own institutions.
Right.
That institutions are essential to economic development. The Nobel Prize was awarded to two economists, one from Harvard, one from MIT, who showed us the importance of institutions. So it's how do they build their institutions, and how do we, as rich countries, want to contribute to their development? And this is all about the geopolitics and the strategies aspect of it. But it's not about the technology. It's not really about the money. It's all about the governance package.
When I sort of enter international venues, I hear two perspectives on this question. From the finance side, which I completely agree, there's plenty of private capital around the world to accomplish this goal. You hear, we don't have projects, right? Bankable projects are just not available at the standards necessary for international capital. And then you go over and you speak to people like frustrated, happy warriors in the developing world, and they say, well, we can't get finance, right? Well, there's plenty of opportunity here. How do we solve, I mean, it's not quite a chicken and an egg issue, but how do we solve that apparent mismatch? And do you see particular tools, whether it's artificial intelligence or renewed vigor in institutional design, helping us break that gap? Because it feels like I read about it every time I read a Global Energy Outlook. I read about it, climate finance issues, when COP comes around, And yet we've made less progress than I think we would have liked to.
That's absolutely right. The challenge, of course, is that the countries that really need that energies are countries that have institutions that are fragile and that are in the process of being built. So I can tell you what we at TotalEnergies are doing.
Please.
That's an example, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure how replicable that is, but we have two big projects that are in developing countries. One is in Iraq. Iraq, as you know, is a war-torn country. And here what we do is that we operate an oil field, and with the proceeds from the oil field, we're able to finance a solar plant. So we solve the issue of the financing by linking the solar activity to some of the proceeds of the oil field. So it's an integrated energy development project. The other project we have is in India. India is an enormously growing country. Today, India produces a lot of coal, uses a lot of coal to produce electricity. So converting India from coal to solar or to renewable in general is a massive, important issue for us. So what we do here is we build the biggest solar farm in the world, and we build that with a local partner, which just manages the country risk for us, and that provides us with a risk profile that's acceptable for us. So there's no easy answer to the question you're asking, which is the core of the issue, but those are the solutions. Now, there is something else that's being developed, which is called blended finance, which is some risk sharing between private capital and government. Yeah. But again, that requires cooperation, multilateral cooperations,
right,
and government saying, we're going to set up a guarantee mechanism. We're not going to finance all the project. It's going to be private capital, but we're going to take a share of the risk. Right. And if you take 10% of the risk, you can reduce the cost of capital and make the project bankable. Those are the issues that people are struggling with, but you're absolutely right. That there's a yawning gap between the need and the opportunity and what is actually being done.
How do you see this playing out in a world that feels like it's getting more geopolitical? So for the past 40 years, our approach to climate particularly, and I think also to economic development, has been very focused on global cooperation, large international institutions. As we enter a time where it feels like there's more focus on bilateralism, maybe plurilateralism, countries want to work with security partners, how is that going to change our picture of the evolving energy system?
That's of course, nobody knows the answer, right? But
that's why we come to you.
Exactly, right. But there are some pointers to that. The first one, I think, is to realize that providing energy to the developing world is really in the best interest of developed economies. Yeah. There's tremendous work that was done at the IMF, actually, a couple of years ago, on what they call the Great Carbon Arbitrage. And I show that it is in the selfish interest of the United States to reduce the emissions of the developing world, because the cost of emissions abatement is significantly lower than the cost of not doing it, right? Global warming, loss of GDP, US GDP is massive, so even if you lose only 1% of GDP, it's an enormous amount of money, much more than it would cost to actually decarbonize some of the regions. Then there's a second dimension. So there's a clean economic interest. And then there's a second dimension, which is a security dimension. It is kind of obvious, but if you have poor people living in a place that is very close by to rich people, the poor people tend to move from the poor place to the rich place. And if we want to have a safe world, it's all about making sure that our neighbors have sufficient energy to have decent lives. Right. So for those reasons, you should see some work. So long-winded answer, if we don't have global cooperation, we'll find some regional cooperations. Blocks that are going to say, well, look, we're going to help you because it's in our best interest to help you. So It seems like the Chinese are doing that with their neighbors.
Yeah.
Certainly the Europeans were trying, and I suspect the US will take a more continental view.
We have a tough relationship with our neighbors at the moment.
You do have a tough relationship with your neighbors, but at the end of the day, to answer your questions, the outcome, and I'm not sure it's efficient, I'm not sure it's desirable, but a possible outcome is just by regional blocks.
Maybe you could give us a few comments on how this looks in Europe, right? So Europe had very deep energy ties with its neighbor Russia. Those have been severed for the time being, at least. There's a long history of investment in resource development and now clean energy investment in Northern Africa. What's the picture that you see evolving going forward?
Europe is at a very peculiar situation because for the first time in our history, we don't have primary energy. So, when you go back to the Industrial Revolution, it was coal we have. Then, oil, we don't have oil, but we got lucky. We managed to find some in Iraq, and we managed to have access to some oil in Africa and in the Middle East. And then we had access to oil in the North Sea. So our primary energy situation was not ideal, but we had some. And then we had Russian gas. Russian gas is really a gift for Europe because it's right there at the border. It has been burning for 100 years. So, we have those pipes that have been going for a long, long time. And now we have none of that anymore. So in Europe, we find ourselves waking up saying, well, we don't have primary energy. So all of a sudden, anything that is energy intensive costs much more to make in Europe because we have to take the energy from somewhere and bring it to Europe.
Yeah.
So we are at a competitive disadvantage to our neighbors. So the short answer is, well, we need to diversify our energy mix pronto. So LNG from the United States, LNG from Qatar. We get some Russian gas one way, shape, or form. Once the peace is signed, there will be gas flowing, certainly not at the level where it was not healthy for us, but there will be some Russian gas.
Right.
So we need to diversify. That's plan A. Plan B, of course, is because of energy is expensive, we have to get high value added products, right? If you cannot make base material with high cost energy, right? So you have to somehow find value-added products. And the third thing, and that's what we are betting on, is renewables, because that would sever the dependency. But that's a very hard thing to do because they are conflicted, right? If you have high energy costs, it means that your industry is suffering. So where do you find the surplus to develop the renewables? So Europe is in a tough place right now. Hopefully it will work out, but it's in a tough spot.
I was just in Europe last week, and one of the things we observed talking to leaders both in Brussels and in the UK is a renewed sense of vigor around solving some of these problems as the US has a more bellicose approach to international relations. What are the key things that you think European leadership needs to accomplish to make sure it meets the challenge that you just described?
It takes me great sadness to say that, but the priority for Europe is just guns.
Right.
And it cannot be overstated how sad it is. When I was lucky, and I mean, some of us in the room are old enough to remember that magic fall in '89, where the Berlin Wall fell. I think it was in October, and Mandela was released, I think, in November or December, and that was a moment of hope, and that was, the optimistic moment at the time. And I remember coming to the US just after that, and Bill Clinton was president, and it was just exuberant. It was really nice. So the first priority for Europe is to build guns. And it's very sad because it's the reverse of what we've experienced in our adult lives. Once you've done that, that's a lot of GDP going into rearming and doing that. Then there needs to be a very complicated conversation within the European public about, look, we live in a different world and we have to think about the world in a different way, and we have to take responsibility for our own defense, and we have to take responsibilities for safety, for security. And that's why I like your center, because you say, well, technology, energy, well, it's really about security. And that's what I like about your approach, right? But we need to have that conversation in Europe, which is not an easy conversation to have with a population that has grown accustomed to a reasonably peaceful life.
Right, and one of the things that our work here is emphasizing is it's not just a matter of physical security.
Sure.
Europe was able to maintain physical energy security, defined as availability, for the most part through the crisis of 22-23. Sure. But the affordability associated with that is completely unsustainable.
Yes.
Right. I mean, the country spending up to 7% of GDP on energy subsidies completely precludes the ability to have an active defense industry or
absolutely
invest in economic dynamism or whatever it might be. And so, one of the connections I think is most important in this coming age is not just physical security, because by and large markets we've learned the right tools, but making sure that economic security is maintained and the right policy tools to do that seems like a key issue. In that vein, one of the things that Europe can do, probably could do more of, is integrate the power grid to take advantage of disparate resources on the Med, up in the North Sea, East and West. There's less diversity than we have here in the United States, though, should peace come in Ukraine, a lot of nuclear power is available from there. What is power grids seem to be, in a world moving from molecules to electrons, a really important strategic asset for countries to invest in, to maintain, to grow. And that's part of the report that you've shared here. What are your views on that? Who's doing it well? Who needs to do better in the context of building out power grids, and how are we going to pay for it all?
The power grid in Europe is actually a big success story. Europe is, and you live in Europe is not like the United States. Every country has its own power grid. In the United States, in particular in the eastern seashore, you have tide pools since the 1970s. So you have PJM, which has operated as a global market since the 1970s after the big collapse, I think, in 78. In Europe, every country had different power system with different rules. And by rules, I mean different definition of the way we operate the system. And over the last 30 years, we've managed to get those grids talking and working together. And in 2022, we lost 100 terawatt hours. The European market is a bit smaller than the American market. It's about 2,000 terawatt hours. So we lost 100 terawatt hours of nuclear. We lost 20 terawatt hours of hydro because it was not raining. And despite all that, the lights have remained on. And then, of course, the price of gas skyrocketed. Mm-hmm. So the integration in Europe, the integration of the spot market is working fairly decently, so much so that we didn't lose power. We didn't have power cuts, even though the system was completely, we lost 120 terawatt hours. So that's a big success. So we are not doing as bad as we could think. What we do need to do more, of course, is more investment. Because we're going to have wind turbines in the North Sea, and we need to get all that power, because nobody lives in the North Sea, actually. You need to get that power and move it back. Move it back up to Norway to be stored in the hydro dams, and then move it back to the rest of Europe. So there's some investment that needs to happen. And that's tricky, because you're going to have to share the cost and the benefits across the countries. And then we have to take a step back and think about the way we want to organize our power system, and especially the long-term contracting aspect. In Europe, as in the US, the price is set by the marginal unit, which is often gas. So price of gas goes up, price of electricity goes up. It's unsustainable for people. Mm-hmm. So we need to find long-term contracting mechanism, and that's making progress. Finally, on the cost, the cost of transmission grid is money, but it's not insurmountable. Of course, right. the French transmission operator produced a report saying they need $100 billion just to accommodate that. But they're just saying we want money, but it's just crazy, right? That's the cost of the entire nuclear fleet, so it's not going to happen. But in reality, when you look at it, it's a non-negligible, but it's not the biggest share of the bill. The U.S., I think, is doing well also on transmission.
We need to build more, I think, in our view, and it pays for itself over time. Yeah. One of the things that we're trying to emphasize is the public investment here creates economic opportunity well beyond what you're paying initially. Absolutely. And that can, for a power system that wasn't growing for 30 years, that was a hard sell. And so we sort of need to reinvigorate our trust in that concept here in the U.S. Colleagues joining online, as well as colleagues here in the room, we're going to turn to questions here in a moment. I've got one more, but I hope you think about that, and we can receive comments submitted on the website here as well. Lastly, I want to talk to you a little bit about the role of gas in the global economy. Replacing coal generation with gas generation has been a big boon for the United States. We are, of course, blessed with a great resource and at lower prices than basically anywhere else in the world. Not everybody enjoys those characteristics, but it's clear that global gas demand is growing, and LNG demand in particular is growing fast. What's your view, and what role does that resource play in the coming years as an energy security tool, as an economic development tool, as a sort of energy systems planning hedge, as we're trying to accomplish all of these goals?
No, that's very important to understand that. Gas as the is really the energy that enables us to transition away from coal. So when you look at coal today, burning coal to produce electricity, it's 10 billion tons of CO2 per year. It's massive. It's the single biggest source of emission. So if you replace that coal by renewables and gas, you eliminate 8 billion tons of CO2. So just gas, you mentioned the United States. 80% of the reduction in emissions in the United States between 2000 and 2022, 85% of the reduction comes from burning gas instead of coal to produce electricity. Historically, the US power grid was coal-related. Now it's gas. 85% of the emissions come from shifting from coal to gas in the US. So that has a massive role to play. And as you said, gas is not available everywhere. So it's available in the United States, available in the Middle East. LNG is, of course, expensive. It's not cheap. But it enables us to move.
We like to think of it as high value.
Exactly, it's high value, exactly. But it's when you bring in gas, LNG to Europe, and using that and to shut down the coal-fired power plant in England and in Germany, it's great value.
Right.
It's great value for the money. And what people need to understand is that, when you have solar panels, if you live close to the sun, close to the equator, you can have solar panels and battery and they match up nicely. If you live in Europe, solar panels are not that performative. They don't perform that well, up north. So we're going to have wind turbines. And the problem of wind turbine is that sometimes the wind doesn't blow for weeks at a time.
Right.
And there you need a gas turbine to actually provide a backup. So gas is a natural source of storage, long-term storage for electricity. So that's why we think gas has a beautiful future ahead of itself, and it's a great energy, and it's high valued. If you want to decarbonize steel is 7% of the world emission. If you want to replace those emissions, if you want to reduce those emissions, you start by burning gas instead of coal. And you know what? You get those emissions down. So gas has a way to ease the transition energy. Now, after 2050, of course, you can say, well, we need to put CCS, we need to not burn gas, but burn H2.
Right.
But for the next 30, 40 years, gas is the way to go. So yes, it's a high-value energy. We're very happy to get it from the United States. No, it's easy, right? It's great.
Why don't we turn to a question in the room, and then I'll take one from online. Colleagues, if you'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand. Please stand, introduce yourself and your institutional affiliation, should you have one. And remember that questions have a brief propositional statement and then a sentence that goes up at the end.
Yes, thank you. Max Koenig with E3G. And I would try to launch in two questions.
It's permitted for you, Max.
Thank you. First one is on the Russia question. You mentioned a return to Russian gas after ceasefire or peace deal. And then what this means in terms of incentive setting also for other rogue players in the world, if we go back to that status quo from before. And then the bigger, maybe more philosophical question, whether the European growth model or economic model is viable in the future, whether we can actually keep going on that, what you said, using cheap energy and our skills to make high-value goods and sell them abroad. Is that a viable future, even in the best circumstances? Thank you.
Thank you.
Easy ones.
Yeah, the Russian gas. I don't think we'll go back to the status quo ex ante. I don't think we'll, get 150 BCM of Russian gas ever again in Europe. But given the proximity of Russia, I could imagine that as part of the negotiation, some deal is found where some Russian gas, maybe a third, a quarter, a sixth of what was flowing before, flows back to Europe. I could imagine that's going to be part of the discussion. Now, as usual, those are complex negotiations or lots of hanging parts.
And it's one of the places where geopolitics and economics collide.
But we cannot ignore the physical reality that Russian gas is very close to Europe. The pipes are built. We cannot ignore that. Now, how the negotiation is going to go, I don't know. And it's way above my pay grade. But I could imagine that that's part of the conversation. The thing that we've learned as Europeans is we do not want to depend that much on Russian gas. So it will never come close to what we had before. But a fraction that comes back makes sense. The broader question on European economic model, that's a very tough question. The thing that is striking when you come to the United States is the energy, not only the physical energy, but the mental energy, the dynamism of society. I mean, when you live in DC, so you may not have noticed that, but when I come back to DC every couple of years, I find new buildings, new stuff. It's just amazing. The United States is always building and growing, and there's just tremendous positive energy. And the question for Europe is, are we going to find in ourselves this kind of energy that enables us to grow and confidently do what we have to do after a period where the growth and the energy has been a bit subdued? And frankly, I don't have the answer. I think maybe we need some Barack Obama to lift our spirits and just get us to rise again. But I think the long and short answer is I think it's all about finding ourselves in a desire to do something together. Mm-hmm. That will drive the rest. And the rest we can handle. I mean, we have scientists. I mean, they're not as good as American scientists, but I mean, we have scientists. We'll find our way around. I mean, we'll do data centers. We'll do, it's not there are people there too. It's 340 million people, and some of them are young and drug. So there's a play, but it requires a kind of a mindset shift.
Question from online. In your scenarios and in your thinking, what role does nuclear play? So
yep.
The international bodies have declared we should triple global nuclear capacity. France has done very well did very well building out a nuclear fleet and has weathered a lot of storms because of it.
Yep.
And yet it is apparently a hard thing for us to do, to expand our nuclear capacity globally at the pace we would like to see for security, decarbonization. And what role is nuclear going to play in this emerging world?
Nuclear, of course, when you're brought up in France, you're brought up to believe that nuclear is the solution to every problem under the sun.
There are many quarters of the internet that agree.
Exactly right, that nuclear is the thing. There are two ways, there are different dimensions. The first one is that we do have, in the United States and in Europe, a well-functioning nuclear fleet. Mm-hmm. And as our fleet ages, we learn that we can actually continue to operate it safely, securely, for a bit longer. So the first thing about nuclear, which we are doing in the United States, you are running your reactors when they are safe and when the NRC agrees, we run them up to 80 years. Mm-hmm. And in France, we're slowly moving to that. So the first thing is just keep running them. And actually, you're reopening in the United States, I think 3 Mile Island, which is a very famous reactor, of course, is reopened. I think there was another one in Maryland that was reopened, or that I think
there are a handful of ones that aren't so decommissioned they can't be restarted.
So the first step is, of course, just operate them, because you know what, they produce electricity without emitting CO2. I mean, they emit a lot of CO2 when you build because there's a lot of concrete, but once it's there, it's low CO2. So the first thing is to operate them. The second is, what do we do next? And on the next, you have to separate two parts of the world. Nuclear is it's a beast. So the countries that do not have nuclear today, we find it hard to believe that they will have nuclear 5, 10 years, 20 years from now. The only counterexample is the United Emirates, United Arab Emirates, that have actually built plants from Korea. But we think it's very rare that new nuclear countries are going to emerge. So we think that nuclear is going to be mostly in countries that already have nuclear. And now then comes the question, do we build them big or do we build them small? And the consensus seems to be small. And I remember I was visiting Berkeley University about 5-6 years ago, and we had this tremendous professor of nuclear physics at Berkeley. And obviously he was there in the 70s and and he was explaining to us, and he said, look, at the end of the day, building those big machines is just too complicated. It's not worth the effort. The economies of scale we thought we'd had by building bigger machines are not materializing. So what we'd rather do is build small, modular reactor, chunk them in assembly lines, and they'll come out cheaper than the big ones, and actually we'll be able to deliver them. Because even Voigte in Georgia is way over budget. I mean, they connected it, I think, in the spring or in the fall last year, but it took 10 years longer than expected, and so on and so forth. So nuclear has a role. We believe small nuclear is more likely than big nuclear, and we do not see a lot of proliferation. Last thing is fusion. Fusion is great. We love nuclear fusion. But it's not going to solve our problem, because nuclear fusion is not going to be operational before 2050. So hopefully we'll have low carbon electricity before 2050.
Right.
But fusion is likely to happen, but it's not. We don't have to. It's not going to solve our problem, but the good news is we don't need fusion because we already have existing nuclear and SMRs.
Leave it to an economist to tell us that magic solutions do not exist.
Exactly.
Free dollar bills, free euros do not sprinkle on themselves on the
Exactly,
sidewalk.
otherwise we'll be picked up by some invisible hand.
Thomas-Olivier, thank you so much for joining us at CSIS today. I really appreciate it. Your insights, your candor are greatly appreciated. And the work that you and your colleagues have done at Total is highly valuable for our efforts, and I think thinkers around the world. So thank you kindly.
Thank you very much. Thank you, guys.
Colleagues, with your warm applause, please thank our speaker.
Thank you very much.